The rain fell heavy over the battlefield in southern Israel in the year 2025. A group of young soldiers stood tense, their weapons ready, their hearts racing. Then, in the middle of the silence, one voice rose above the storm. Levi, barely 19, began to sing a prayer in a language foreign to most of his comrades. It was not Hebrew. It was not English. It was Tagalog, the language of the Philippines. Slowly the others joined him. One by one their voices merged until the haunting words of the prayer Ama Namin carried through the night air. For a brief moment, the fear and anger of war gave way to something unexpected. Unity, hope, and a fragile sense of peace. How did a Filipino prayer find its way into the hearts of Israeli soldiers? How did words carried across oceans become a shield of faith on a battlefield? To answer that, we need to step back, far from the sound of gunfire, to the quiet life of a woman named Rosa Luningning. Rosa Luningning never imagined her life would stretch far beyond the crowded streets of Quezon City. She had spent years working quietly as a nurse, caring for neighbors and patients with the kind of tenderness that seemed almost ordinary to her, but extraordinary to everyone else. By the time she turned 53, her children were grown, her home in Manila was modest but stable, and she longed for a change that could still give her purpose. That was when she accepted an offer to travel to Israel and work as a caregiver for an elderly Jewish woman named Esther Cohen. She arrived in Tel Aviv with little more than a suitcase, 3 rosaries tucked carefully inside, and a heart filled with memories of the Philippines. The city was loud and fast, nothing like the rhythm of her old neighborhood, but Rosa adjusted with the quiet grace she always carried. In Esther's home, she moved through the rooms like a gentle presence, cooking meals, managing medicines, and offering the steady patience that Esther's children had been looking for. Yet beneath her daily routine, Rosa carried with her the voice of her homeland, the prayers she had whispered since childhood, the folk songs she sang while sweeping floors, and the recipes that carried the taste of family. One evening during a Shabbat gathering at Esther's home, Rosa noticed a boy sitting off to the side, silent and withdrawn. His name was Avi. At 16, he carried a weight that seemed too heavy for his age. His sister had been killed in the violence that haunted the southern border, and since then he had retreated into himself, drifting through family gatherings like a shadow. Rosa, who knew the language of grief without needing to share the same words, approached him. She did not begin with advice or pity. Instead, she asked softly if he wanted to hear a prayer from her country. Surprised, Avi nodded. Rosa folded her hands and began to recite the words of Ama Namin, the Lord's Prayer in Tagalog. The rhythm of the unfamiliar language caught Avi's attention. Though he could not understand the words, he felt the calm in her tone, the melody that wrapped around the syllables. When she finished, Avi asked what the words meant. Patiently, Rosa explained line by line, weaving both faith and memory into the explanation. That night was the beginning of something neither of them could have expected. Avi began to ask Rosa to repeat the prayer whenever he visited. Soon he tried to mimic the words, stumbling over the sounds at first, then repeating them with growing confidence. Rosa would laugh gently, correcting his pronunciation, but always with warmth. For Avi, who had lost his sister's voice forever, Rosa's presence was a kind of substitute for family, an anchor in a life that had been adrift. Beyond the prayer, Rosa began sharing pieces of her culture. She sang him the playful folk song, Bahay Kubo, describing the vegetables of a Filipino garden. She cooked adobo in Esther's kitchen, filling the home with a fragrance that was foreign yet comforting. To Avi, these moments were more than lessons. They were bridges to a different kind of life, one that carried tenderness, song, and warmth instead of loss and fear. In time, Avi no longer kept the prayer to himself. He shared it with friends, first shyly, then with conviction. Rosa never asked for this. She had not planned to plant anything beyond kindness in one boy's heart. But as weeks passed, she realized the prayer had started to ripple outward, from Avi to others, reaching young people who were desperate for something to hold on to amid the constant tension of their world. For Rosa, it was a revelation. She had crossed an ocean to work as a caretaker, to offer her hands and time to one elderly woman. Yet somehow, through something as simple as a prayer in her own language, she had become more than a caregiver. To Avi and the others who began to gather around her presence, she was Nani, a mother. Not by blood, not by obligation, but by the quiet, undeniable power of compassion. For Avi, the prayer was more than words. It was the first thread of light that had pierced through months of silence and grief. At 16, he had already seen more loss than many adults. His sister, only a few years older, had been killed in the violence along the southern border. The shock of it had hollowed him out. Once a lively boy, Avi became quiet, distant, and withdrawn. He rarely spoke at family gatherings, often retreating into the background, where his sorrow felt safer than conversation. Rosa's presence changed that. She never pressed him to talk about his pain, never asked him to explain what could not be explained. Instead, she gave him something simple and steady. Each time she recited Ama Namin, he listened, then repeated, then began to own the words himself. The rhythm became familiar, like a heartbeat he could lean on. It was not his language, but somehow it felt like it belonged to him. The act of learning the prayer gave Avi a sense of control he had not felt since his sister's death. When he stumbled over a phrase, Rosa corrected him with patience. When he finally spoke it smoothly from start to finish, she smiled as if he had accomplished something extraordinary. To Avi, who often felt invisible, those moments of recognition mattered more than he could admit. As weeks turned into months, Avi began to carry the prayer beyond Esther's house. At first it was private, a whisper before bed, a habit that made him feel close to the calm Rosa had given him. But soon he shared it with friends. One afternoon, sitting with two classmates who were struggling with their own fears about the future, Avi spoke the words aloud. The others listened, curious, then asked him to repeat it. They laughed at his careful pronunciation, but then they tried it themselves. What began as a curiosity became a ritual. By the time Avi turned 17 and prepared for military service, Ama Namin was no longer just Rosa's prayer or his own. It had become something larger. He carried it with him into training, teaching it to fellow recruits as if it were a secret strength. The words spread in barracks and training grounds, not as doctrine but as comfort. For young men who lived each day with the threat of war, the prayer offered a sense of belonging, a rhythm to breathe by when fear closed in. Avi himself began to change. The boy who had once drifted silently on the edges of life now had a voice others listened to. He was not the strongest or the boldest among the recruits, but he carried something rare, a kind of calm rooted in loss, transformed into compassion. His fellow soldiers saw it when he led them in the unfamiliar words of the prayer, steadying their nerves before night patrols or during tense moments. In his own way, Avi had taken the gift Rosa gave him and made it his own. He could never bring back his sister, but through the prayer he found a way to honor her, to transform grief into a force that connected him with others. The boy who had once seemed broken now became a bridge, carrying Rosa's quiet strength into places she herself would never walk. By the time Avi's unit was sent south, the prayer had already become part of their lives. Among the soldiers was Levi, 19 years old, still carrying the uncertainty of youth beneath his uniform. He was strong, quick to laugh during training, but in quiet moments he admitted to himself that fear was always near. The tension of the border, the constant alerts, the long nights with the sound of distant gunfire, all of it weighed heavily on him and his friends. When Avi first shared the prayer in the barracks, Levi listened with curiosity. The words were unfamiliar, the sounds unlike anything he had heard. Yet the way Avi recited them, calm, steady, almost protective, made Levi want to repeat them. Soon the others joined in, stumbling through the syllables, laughing at their own mistakes, but finding comfort in the rhythm. What began as a small act of friendship grew into something more. Before night patrols, Avi would lead the group in the prayer. The words became a ritual, not because they understood every line, but because they understood the feeling it carried. It reminded them of home, of family dinners and songs, of something softer than the harshness of their training. For Levi, it was a shield that no weapon could provide, a way to breathe when the air felt too heavy. There was one night in particular when the prayer revealed its true strength. Rain poured down on the southern fields, the soldiers bracing themselves for confrontation. The tension was unbearable. Levi looked around at his comrades, saw the fear mirrored in their eyes, and felt the weight of silence pressing on all of them. Then, without waiting, he began to sing. The words of Aman Amin rose into the storm, shaky at first, then stronger as Avi joined him, then the others. In that moment, something shifted. The rain kept falling. The war had not disappeared, but the soldiers stood together not as isolated boys in uniform, but as a single voice. The prayer in Tagalog, born thousands of miles away, had become their anchor. For Levi and the others, it was proof that even in the darkest moments, a simple song could carry the power to hold fear at bay. When the story of those young soldiers spread, it carried with it more than surprise. News outlets described the strange scene of Israeli recruits singing a Filipino prayer in the middle of a rain-soaked night. Some called it unusual, others called it moving. But for the soldiers themselves and for the woman who had unknowingly given them this gift, it was something deeper. They began to call Rosa Nanay, the Tagalog word for mother. It was not a title she had sought, but it became her name among them. Letters reached her, written in Hebrew and English, sometimes clumsy with grammar, but overflowing with gratitude. "You reminded us that we are human," one soldier wrote. Another called her the voice that calmed our fear. Rosa kept these letters folded neatly, the ink smudged from her own tears. The story of the prayer traveled far. Journalists described her as the song in the middle of war. Community groups in Israel spoke of her as a symbol of compassion, proof that kindness could cross borders, languages, and faiths. For Rosa, the attention was bewildering. She had not set out to change anyone's life. She had come to Israel to care for one elderly woman, to earn a living, and to carry her quiet faith across the sea. Yet somehow the small seeds she had planted, through a prayer, a song, a meal, had grown into something larger than herself. When her time in Israel ended and she returned to Quezon City, Rosa carried more than her suitcase. She carried a stack of letters from the soldiers, photographs of their unit, and small gifts they had pressed into her hands. She returned to her modest home, the streets noisy and familiar, the smell of Manila's markets wrapping around her. But her life was no longer the same. Each time she prayed Aman Aman, she thought of the boys in uniform, their voices rising together in the rain. Back in Israel, the young men who had once stumbled over Tagalog words continued to repeat them. Some carried the prayer quietly in their pockets. Others recited it aloud before missions. To them, the prayer was not just foreign syllables. It was a reminder of family, of tenderness, of the idea that humanity could survive even in the harshest places. The legacy of Rosa's time abroad did not rest only on the battlefield or in the headlines. It lived in the ordinary, everyday ways those soldiers carried themselves afterward. They wrote to her about helping strangers, about remembering to sing when fear rose up, about cooking meals for their families with the recipe she had once shown them. She had not only given them words, she had given them a way to hold on to compassion. For Rosa, the greatest recognition was not being called a symbol, but knowing that her culture, Filipino warmth, faith, and gentleness, had crossed borders in the most unexpected way. It was proof that what she had always believed was true. Compassion is not diminished when shared. It multiplies. Her story is a reminder that even the smallest gestures can ripple outward in ways we cannot imagine. A prayer whispered in Tagalog, a folk song hummed in a kitchen, a meal shared with strangers. These are not grand acts. Yet in the right moment, they can change the course of lives, even the lives of soldiers standing at the edge of war. And so the story closes where it began, with voices rising in the storm. Young men on foreign soil, bound not only by duty but by a prayer from a faraway land, carried across oceans by one woman's faith. In their unity, we hear a truth larger than war itself, that hope, compassion, and the quiet strength of culture can outlast even the darkest of nights.